The snow swallowed the taxi's taillights in less than 10 seconds. It carried away her stepmother, her half-brother, and a $200,000 settlement check, everything left of the 8 years Cora Whitfield had spent breaking her back as a housemaid. What they left behind, on the iron bench of a bus station long since shut down. One suitcase with a frayed handle, and a 27-year-old woman with a rusted steel brace wrapped around her right leg. It was cold enough to freeze a breath before it could become a word. In the distance, abandoned freight cars sat silent along the rail line that ran toward the port, the kind of place people passed through, never stopped. Cora watched the tire tracks. The wind was erasing them, inch by inch, patient and quiet, as if the whole world had agreed to wipe away the evidence of an abandonment. "Wait here a little while. I'll call someone to come pick you up." Darlene had said it without meeting her eyes. She was looking at the check made out in her name, signed during the days Cora lay unconscious in a hospital bed, not yet knowing her legs would never run again. And Randy, her half-brother, had taken her wallet and her phone. "I'll hold on to these. Lots of thieves around here." There was no one coming. There was only the out-of-service sign rattling in the wind, and the darkness rising off the horizon like floodwater. Cora pushed herself up on her crutch. She had to move. Anywhere, anything but sitting still while the cold finished the job that sports car had left undone. The tip of the crutch slid on black ice. She went down hard. Her chin struck the concrete. The taste of blood spread across her tongue, mixing with the taste of snow. The crutch skittered 10 feet away, and to her, in that moment, 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles. Cora lay there, cheek pressed to the ice, listening to her own heartbeat slow. At first, the cold tore at her. Then it softened, gentle, in a way that was a lie, like a blanket someone had draped loosely over her shoulders. She knew that blanket's name. That was how people froze to death, more and more comfortable, until they simply fell asleep. People like you should cry quietly. Her stepmother's voice echoed in her head, and for the first time in her life, Cora did not cry quietly. She let out a laugh, dry, broken, white in the frozen air. Then 2 headlight beams cut through the wall of snow. A long black car slowed, stopped. The door opened, and a man stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, black overcoat hanging open as if the knife-edged cold meant nothing to him. The light caught a thin scar running along his jaw. He didn't ask who she was. Didn't ask why a woman was lying in an abandoned bus station in the dead of night. He simply stood there looking at the suitcase, at the steel brace showing beneath the hem of her pants, at the blood drying on her chin. There was not 1 ounce of pity in those gray eyes. "You planning to die here?" he said, his voice low and steady as an idling engine. "Or, are you getting in?" Cora didn't know who this man was. She didn't know that the entire city only spoke his name in whispers. She knew only one thing in 27 years of living. This was the first person who had ever asked her what she wanted. She spat the taste of blood from her mouth. "I'm getting in." If Cora's journey touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories still to come. The inside of the car was another country. Cora sank into leather the color of dark coffee, and the heat rose around her like water filling a tub, slow and merciful, thawing her fingers 1 knuckle at a time. The man said nothing. He sat across from her with his eyes on the window, the scar along his jaw catching the glow of passing streetlights, and somewhere in front of them, a driver guided the long black car through the storm, as if the storm were a rumor. She wanted to stay awake. Some animal instinct told her that a woman should never sleep in a stranger's car, that she should watch the road, memorize the turns, keep 1 hand on the door. But 8 years of scrubbing floors had taught her body a different lesson, that warmth was rare and rest was rarer, and when both arrived at once, you did not argue. Her eyes closed before the city lights did, and in the dark behind her eyelids, the past came for her 1 last time. Headlights leaping out of the rain like something alive, the shriek of brakes that came too late to matter, a white hospital ceiling that stayed white for 3 weeks, while machines counted her heartbeats out loud. And when she finally opened her eyes, the first thing waiting for her was not a family member's face, but an envelope propped against her food tray, cream-colored paper, the Ashworth crest embossed in the corner, 3 polite sentences informing her that her services were no longer required. She never dreamed of it again after that night. Some part of her must have known there would be no need. When Cora woke, the car had stopped, and the world outside the glass had changed shape entirely. A wall of wrought iron rolled open without a sound. Beyond it, A driveway curved through snow-banked trees toward a house that was not a house at all but a statement. 3 stories of gray stone rising against the white blur of Lake Michigan, windows lit gold in the darkness. Everything about it built to outlast the people who looked at it. She had spent 8 years inside a rich man's home. She knew wealth the way a fish knows water, but the Ashworth estate had been decorated to impress guests. This place had no interest in impressing anyone. It sat above the frozen shore like a fortress that had simply decided, at some point, to also be beautiful. The car eased to a stop before the entrance, and that was when she saw them. 2 men stood at the base of the steps, hatless in the falling snow, and the snow on their shoulders said they had been standing there a long time. The taller one held a leather briefcase flat across both palms, offering it the way a servant offers a dish, and neither man moved until the car door opened. The man stepped out into the cold without hurrying. Through the gap of the open door, Cora watched the 2 men bow their heads, watched the briefcase rise an inch higher in offering, and watched her rescuer walk past it as if it were empty air. He paused beside the taller man. He said something, one short sentence, too quiet for the wind to carry, too quiet for her to hear even a syllable of it. She could not hear it, but she could see what it did. The tall man's face lost its color the way a window loses light when a curtain drops. The briefcase sank. Both men backed away from the steps, backed all the way to a dark sedan parked in the shadows of the tree line, and drove out through the iron gates into the teeth of the storm. Tail lights shrinking, gone. Nobody waited out a Chicago blizzard on frozen steps for a favor. Men stood in the snow like that for forgiveness, and they had not gotten it. Cora sat very still in the warm leather silence, her heart tapping against her ribs, understanding for the first time that the quiet man with the gray eyes had not simply given her a ride. He had carried her across a border into a country with its own laws, its own weather, its own king. The door on her side opened. Cold poured in, and with it his voice, low and even, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "Can you walk?" She looked up at him, at the snow settling on his shoulders and refusing to melt, and she gathered her crutch. "I can," she said. He watched her work her way out of the car, one careful movement at a time, and he did not offer his hand, and something in her was grateful for that. The great doors of the stone house swung open before them, spilling amber light across the snow, and Cora Whitfield crossed the threshold into the world of a man whose name the whole city was afraid to say out loud. The entrance hall was tall enough to swallow sound. Cora stood dripping melted snow onto marble, the color of bone, and the first thing she noticed was what the house did not have. No portraits, no flowers, no small, soft objects meant to make a visitor feel welcome. Everything in sight had a function, the way everything in a well-kept engine has a function, and she understood without being told that the man who owned this place did not collect things. He used them. Grayson shrugged off his overcoat and hung it himself, which surprised her, and then he turned and looked at her the way a foreman looks at a delivery he has not yet decided to sign for. "Here is how this works," he said. "You have a roof. The roof costs labor. Kitchen, floors, whatever the house needs, whatever your leg allows, and some of what it does not. You get a room, meals, and a wage. Nobody here will carry you, and nobody here will mock you. The first person who does either answers to me." He said it all in one level tone. No warmth, no cruelty. The voice of a man reading terms he had already decided were fair. Cora tightened her grip on the crutch. "Why?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Something moved behind the gray eyes, there and gone, like a fish below ice. "I don't leave things lying dead at my gate," he said. "Even things I haven't found a use for yet." The words should have insulted her. A year of polite Ashworth smiles had insulted her more. This was the first honest offer anyone had made her since the accident, and honesty, she was learning, had its own strange kindness. A stout, gray-haired woman appeared at the end of the hall, the housekeeper, summoned by nothing Cora could see, and Grayson said one word, "Mrs. Pell," and walked away toward the staircase, without a goodbye. Mrs. Pell led her down a corridor into the staff wing, and the whole way there the older woman's eyes kept dropping to the crutch, to the rusted brace, measuring, doubting, adding sums that clearly did not balance. The room was small and clean. A bed, a dresser, a window facing the frozen lake, a folded stack of gray work clothes on the blanket. "Breakfast duty starts before light, Mrs. Pell said from the doorway, and her gaze slid down the steel one more time. We move fast in this house. All of us. The door clicked shut on the unspoken half of the sentence. Cora sat on the edge of the bed, ran her thumb along the frayed handle of her suitcase, and made herself a promise in the silence, the same promise she had made face down on the ice, that whatever this house asked of her, it would not find her wanting. Upstairs, in a study lined with ledgers instead of novels, a single lamp burned. Sawyer came in without knocking, because he was the only man alive with that privilege, and laid a thin folder on the desk. He was past 40, built like a dock piling, and he had a habit of saying the least that the moment required. "The woman," he said. Grayson opened the folder. A hospital admission from the winter before. A hit and run on a service road in the rain. 3 weeks unconscious. Permanent damage to the right leg, and then the part that made his eyes stop moving. A police file so thin it was almost weightless. No paint samples, no tire analysis, no canvas of the block, no suspect, case marked inactive in under a month. He had read 100 police files in his life, files on men who had vanished, files his own lawyers had picked apart, and he knew what an honest dead end looked like. This was not a dead end. This was a road someone had paved over. "Somebody clean this," Sawyer said. Grayson turned the pages once more, the settlement signed by a stepmother, while the victim lay unconscious, the money gone, the family gone, the girl left at a dead bus station on the coldest night of the year. Whoever had erased the driver had money, patience, and reach, and no name anywhere in these pages. He closed the folder and slid it into the desk drawer, and the lock made a small, precise sound in the quiet room. "Watch her," he said. "Not because I distrust her." Sawyer waited. "Because whoever did this thinks she's finished," Grayson said, and turned off the lamp. 2 weeks into her new life, the house tested her. It happened on a morning when frost had sealed the kitchen windows white, and Mrs. Pell came down the corridor moving faster than Cora had ever seen her move, her face the color of old paste. The cook was gone, a family emergency downstate, no replacement possible before nightfall. And nightfall was the problem, because at nightfall 12 men were coming to dinner. Not friends. Cora had learned enough by then to read the weather inside the house, and all week the weather had been building toward this dinner the way pressure builds before a storm. Port men, shipping men, the kind of partners who measured respect in details and read weakness in a cold soup. Mrs. Pell stood in the middle of the kitchen turning in a slow circle, and the 2-day maids looked at their shoes, and nobody said anything, because saying something meant owning what came next. Cora set down the silver she was polishing. "I can cook for 12, she said. Every head turned. Mrs. Pell's eyes went where they always went, down to the brace, and stayed there. 8 years, Cora said. Dinners for 20, sometimes 30. I know the timing. I know the order of service. Give me the pantry and stay out of my way." It was the longest speech she had made under that roof, and for a moment the kitchen was so quiet she could hear the frost ticking on the glass. Then Mrs. Pell untied her own apron and held it out, which in the language of that house was either a blessing or a sentence. The afternoon burned away in steam. Cora built the meal like a bricklayer builds a wall, course by course. Nothing fancy. Nothing that could fail. Roasted beef that forgave a busy cook. Root vegetables glazed dark. Bread warmed twice. A soup that only got better the longer it waited. 4 hours on her feet. The brace bit into her calf until her whole leg rang like a struck pipe, and she learned to hook her elbow over the steel counter's edge and let her arms carry what her leg could not. Reaching for the oven, she misjudged the angle of a hot tray, and pain seared a white stripe across the back of her hand. And she ran it under cold water for the length of one slow breath, wrapped it in clean cloth, and went back to the stove, because in her experience pain had never once finished a meal, and neither had crying. Through the swinging door she heard the guests arrive, heard the low rumble of men who filled a room on purpose, and when she carried the first course in, she understood what kind of table she was serving. 12 faces that had all seen weather, rings that had never known work, conversation that moved like a card game, everyone holding something back, and at the head of it Grayson, saying almost nothing, while the almost nothing ran the entire room. She saw it happen with her own eyes as she set down the plates. Mid-sentence, mid-laugh. Grayson picked up his knife and fork, and then set them back down against the china with a small, deliberate click. And the table went silent from one end to the other, 12 powerful men going quiet at once like a radio switched off, waiting to hear why. He spoke 4 unhurried sentences about the harbor, and picked his fork back up, and the room breathed again. Later, clearing the 3rd course, she watched a thick-necked man with a diamond on his smallest finger interrupt him, lean across the table and talk over him about birthing rights, and Grayson did not answer and did not blink. He simply looked at the man, only looked, and the silence stretched until it had a temperature. And it was the interrupter's own partner who reached over, gripped his shoulder, and pulled him back down into his chair, like a man pulling a friend back from a ledge. Cora carried out the empty plates with her pulse loud in her ears. She had spent 8 years around money. She had never once been around power, and now she knew the difference. Money talked, power waited, and the whole world lowered its voice to listen. It was long past midnight when the last car rolled out through the iron gates. Cora stood at the sink, easing her weight off the screaming leg, the burn on her hand throbbing under its bandage, 12 settings washed and racked and shining in the drying rose. She did not hear him come in. Grayson stood in the kitchen doorway with his collar open, and his gray eyes moved slowly across the clean counters, the racked china, the pots hung back in their stations, and came to rest on her bandaged hand, gripping the counter's edge. He looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and he nodded. Once, a single, slow drop of a chin that had never once bowed to anyone in that city, and he turned and was gone. Cora stood alone in the spotless kitchen with her throat aching, and she could not remember, in 27 years of living, anyone ever paying her a higher compliment. On Saturday morning, the house changed its voice. Cora heard it before she understood it. Doors opening upstairs that usually stayed shut. Mrs. Pell humming in the corridor, actual humming, and then the sound that explained everything. Small, quick footsteps on the marble, lighter than rain. She was rolling dough at the big kitchen table when the door swung open a crack, and a face appeared in the gap. A little girl of 5 or 6 with a cloud of honey-colored curls and enormous brown eyes that went straight to the mixing bowls. "Are you making cookies?" the girl asked, in the tone of someone conducting very important official business. "I could be," Cora said. "Do you know anything about cookies?" The girl pushed the door all the way open and marched in wearing a yellow dress and one untied shoe. "I know everything about cookies. I'm Poppy. This is my uncle's house, but my room here is pink." Cora bit back a smile, hooked a stool with her free hand, and then did something no adult in that child's memory had apparently ever done. She eased herself down onto the bench so that her eyes were level with Poppy's eyes. No towering, no talking down through the air, just 2 bakers meeting at the same altitude. Poppy studied her with frank curiosity, looked at the crutch leaning against the table, and asked if it was a wizard's staff. "On good days," Cora said, and Poppy accepted this completely, the way children accept the best answers, and climbed onto the stool with the seriousness of a surgeon scrubbing in. They made cookies, or rather, Cora made cookies while Poppy supervised, which meant flour, a great deal of flour. Flour on the table and the stool and the front of the yellow dress, and one glorious puff of it that went up like a tiny snowstorm when Poppy clapped her hands directly over the bowl and settled, perfectly, on the very tip of her nose. She went cross-eyed trying to look at it. Cora laughed, a real laugh, from a place in her chest she had thought was boarded up, and Poppy laughed because Cora was laughing, and the sound of the 2 of them filled the kitchen and floated down the corridor and out into the tall, cold rooms of that stone house, like something the architecture had been waiting years to hold. While the first tray baked, Poppy narrated her entire life with her chin in her hands, how she lived with Great Aunt June out where the school had a real pond, how Aunt June let her feed the ducks but only the polite ones, how she came here on weekends and holidays, and how her uncle's car was so long she could do a somersault in it, though she was not allowed, though she had. Cora listened and understood the shape of what she was hearing. A child kept wrapped in an ordinary childhood, school and ducks, and a great aunt's garden, far from the tall gray house and everything that moved through it, and she understood too that this arrangement was nobody's accident. When the tray came out and the kitchen filled with the smell of warm sugar, Poppy insisted the first cookie go to Cora, because guests go first, and Cora was newer. It was at that moment, turning with the cookie in her bandaged hand, that Cora saw him. Grayson stood in the doorway, shoulder against the frame. There was no reading his face, but he had been there long enough that the flour dust had settled, and when Poppy shouted for him to come try one, he said he was needed elsewhere. and stayed exactly where he was for one heartbeat longer, watching the woman and the child laughing in the warm, bright room before he walked away. Winter deepened, and without anyone announcing it, the house began to run on Cora's clock. It happened the way ice thickens, quietly, layer by layer. She learned which floorboards in the east corridor complained, and stepped around them on early mornings. She learned that Mrs. Pell's temper tracked the delivery schedule and headed it off with coffee. She learned the rotation of the drivers, the names of the groundsmen, which doors were oiled weekly, and which were left to squeal on purpose so that no one could cross them unheard. The staff had stopped watching her crutch. Now they watched her hands, because her hands were usually pointing at whatever needed doing next, and by midwinter even Mrs. Pell had started asking her opinion in the small, sideways manner of a proud woman conceding territory 1 inch at a time. But the deepest fluency Cora acquired that winter had nothing to do with menus or linens. She learned to read the man of the house the way sailors read sky. Grayson said almost nothing, so his body did the talking for anyone patient enough to study it, and she studied it without meaning to, the way you memorize a language you hear every day. Shoulders carried high and tight when he came through the door meant a deal had cracked somewhere out in the world of docs and manifests, and on those nights she had strong coffee waiting in the study before he asked. A jaw working slowly behind closed lips meant numbers refusing to balance. And once, only once that winter, she saw the rarest weather of all. Grayson standing at the tall window unclasping his wristwatch with slow, deliberate care, setting it face down on the sill, and looking out at the frozen lake with eyes gone perfectly flat. And the following morning, 2 names she had grown used to hearing around the loading schedules were never spoken in that house again. She did not ask. In that country, you did not ask. You noted the sky and trimmed your sails. On her own evenings, in the small room facing the lake, she performed a burial. It took her most of February. From the bottom of the frayed suitcase she had drawn the last artifact of her former life, the housemaid's uniform jacket, charcoal wool, and over the breast pocket the Ashworth family crest stitched in silver thread, a hawk over crossed keys, the emblem she had worn while she scrubbed their staircases and the emblem that had watched her be discarded. A weaker night might have burned it. Instead, she took her needle, and stitch by stitch, evening by evening, she unpicked the silver hawk from the wool, thread by patient thread, until nothing remained of it but a faint ghost of holes, and then she cut the good cloth into panels and sewed them into a plain working apron, gray, sturdy, anonymous, and hung it on the kitchen hook with the others. 8 years of her life, dismantled at the seams and remade into something useful. She found she slept better after that. The house kept 2 mysteries from her, and she cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, without touching. The first was a door. At the end of the second-floor hallway, past the linen closets, one room stayed locked in a house where she now held keys to nearly everything, and Mrs. Pell had mentioned it exactly once, on Cora's first tour, in the voice people reserve for graves. Nobody cleans that room. Nobody opens that door. Cora dusted the hallway to its end twice a week and let the door keep its silence. The second mystery wore a camel overcoat and arrived on Thursdays. His name was Whitmore, the head lawyer, 12 years in Grayson's service by Mrs. Pell's accounting, silver at the temples, a smile calibrated to the millimeter, and he alone of every soul who entered that house walked to the study door and opened it without knocking. Even Sawyer knocked, 1 knuckle, twice. Whitmore did not, and each time Cora watched that soft, confident hand turn the handle uninvited, something at the base of her skull tightened by 1 small degree, an instinct with no evidence to stand on, so she filed it away in the growing ledger she kept behind her eyes, where a housemaid records the things a house pretends no one can see. Christmas arrived at the gray stone house like a truce. For 1 weekend the tall cold rooms surrendered to warmth, fires lit in hearths. Cora had only ever cleaned, cinnamon and pine drifting down corridors that usually smelled of nothing at all, and at the center of it, conducting the whole holiday like a tiny general in a red sweater, was Poppy. Great Aunt June had delivered her on Friday with 2 suitcases and a shopping bag of homemade ornaments, and by Saturday afternoon, the child had staged a full occupation of the main hall, where a spruce twice the height of a man stood waiting to be decorated. Cora was drafted immediately. Poppy assigned jobs with great ceremony. Cora was in charge of the middle branches. Mrs. Pell the ribbons, a laughing groundsman was sent up the ladder for the star, and Poppy herself handled quality control, standing back with her fists on her hips after each ornament, and declaring it perfect or crooked, with no appeals allowed. Somewhere in the happy chaos, she discovered that a string of spare lights reached exactly from the outlet to where Cora stood, and with the focused delight of a 6-year-old artist, she wound the twinkling strand around Cora's crutch, from handle to tip, stood back, went cross-eyed with joy, and announced that it was now a candy cane, and possibly magic. Cora walked the hall all evening, glowing red and gold at every step, and did not take the lights off even once. Dinner that night was small and bright, just family and the senior staff at one end of the long table, Poppy enthroned on a cushion between her great-aunt and her uncle, candles doubling themselves in the dark windows. It was during the quiet after the main course, in one of those pauses that fall over tables, that Poppy turned her enormous brown eyes on Cora and asked, with the pure, unguarded curiosity of children, whether her leg hurt. The table went still. Mrs. Pell's fork stopped in the air. Great-Aunt June drew a breath to redirect the conversation, and Cora caught the old woman's eye and gave a tiny shake of her head, because the question deserved better than rescue. She leaned toward Poppy the way she had leaned that first morning in the kitchen, eye to eye, baker to baker. "It hurts," she said, "sometimes a lot. But this leg carried me all the way here, to this table, to this tree, to you. So the way I see it, it is doing a very good job." Poppy considered this with the gravity of a judge, nodded, satisfied, and returned to the extremely serious matter of dessert, and conversation flowed back over the moment like water over a stone. But at the head of the table, Grayson had set his glass down without drinking, and set it down so carefully that it made no sound at all, and for the rest of the meal his eyes returned to Cora, the way a compass needle returns to north. Hours later the house had gone soft and sleeping. Poppy had been carried up to the pink room mid-protest, and was dreaming before her head found the pillow. Great-Aunt June had retired, the staff had gone, and Cora sat alone near the great tree with a cup of tea, watching the strings of lights blink through their slow, patient colors across the dark hall. She did not hear him come in. She never heard him. Grayson took the chair across from her, set down a glass he was not drinking, and for a while they sat in the blinking dark, saying nothing. Two people who had both learned young that silence was safer than speech. Then he asked. Quietly, no preamble, the way he asked about shipments and schedules. He asked what had happened to her, and Cora understood that he was not asking about the leg. He was asking about all of it. She looked into her tea for a long moment, and then, in a low voice, with the lights washing red and then gold across her face, she told him. She told it plainly, without decoration and without tears, the way you report weather that has already passed, and Grayson listened without moving, and the only signs that the story was landing anywhere were her knuckles whitening slowly around the handle of the teacup, and his eyes going darker by degrees, like a sky losing the last of its light. When she finished, there was only one sentence left in her, and she said it to the fire rather than to him. "They never even tried to find out who hit me," she said. The logs settled. The lights blinked red, then gold. Grayson said nothing at all. But across the dark hall, in the locked ledger behind his eyes, something was quietly written down and underlined. The knock never came, which was how she knew. Deep in the night after New Year, with a blizzard leaning its whole weight against the western windows, Cora woke to the sound of the front doors opening wrong. Too slow, too heavy, and then a voice in the entrance hall calling her name. Sawyer's voice, stripped of all its calm, and she had never once heard Sawyer raise his voice. She was down the corridor faster than she had moved in a year, the crutch striking marble like a drumbeat, and what she found at the base of the great staircase stopped the breath in her chest. Grayson was on the bottom step, half sitting, half fallen, one arm clamped hard against his left side, and his white shirt was no longer white. A darkness had soaked through it and was spreading slowly under his pressed hand, and his face had gone the gray of lake ice. Sawyer knelt beside him, phone jammed to his ear, saying words like watched and waiting and not the hospital, and through the roaring in her ears Cora assembled the shape of the night. The hospital was exactly where somebody expected him to go. There were men posted near it who did not work for any hospital. The family doctor was stranded beyond the storm barricades on the far side of the city, an hour out, maybe 2 in this weather, and Sawyer was needed on the road right now, tonight, because whoever had known where Grayson would be this evening had known it from inside, and every minute that passed was a minute the answer got farther away. Both men were looking at a problem with no third option. Cora gave them one. "Move him to the study," she said, and her voice came out level and foreign to her, the voice of somebody she was only now meeting. Sawyer looked up. She was already turning, already inventorying the house in her head. Clean linen in the second-floor closet, the first aid chest in the pantry, boiled water, good light. 8 years, she said to Sawyer, not explaining, commanding. 8 years I nursed a bedridden woman through every kind of night there is. I know pressure. I know shock. I know when a body is winning and when it is losing. He cannot wait for the roads, and he cannot go where they are waiting for him, so he gets me. Get him on the sofa, and go find the name of whoever sold him. Something passed across Sawyer's face that might have been the birth of respect. And then it was motion. The big man carrying his employer into the study, Mrs. Pell running for linens with her nightdress flying, and Cora washing her hands to the elbow like a surgeon while the storm screamed against the glass. The next hour was the longest of her life, and she was strangely calm inside it. She cut the ruined shirt away and did not let herself feel anything about what the fabric had been hiding. She pressed clean folded cloth over the worst of it, and leaned her weight in and held it, counting, watching the darkness slow its spreading, and finally, grudgingly, stop, and she bound him tight around the ribs with strips of torn sheet. Tight enough that he growled low in his chest without waking, which she took as a good sign, because pain meant the body was still filing complaints. The dangerous part was the waiting. His skin went cold and damp, his breathing shallowed, and she knew this thief of a condition by name from the old woman's bad winters. So she buried him in every blanket in the room, propped his boots up on cushions, and talked. She talked without stopping. She narrated the kitchen, the delivery schedules, Mrs. Pell's feud with the fish supplier, Poppy's opinions on ornament placement, anything, everything. A rope of ordinary words thrown across dark water, and whenever his eyes drifted shut too long, she squeezed his cold hand hard and ordered him back. Once, near the worst of it, his gaze found her face and stayed there with a strange, faraway confusion, as if he were looking at her through years instead of lamplight, and she leaned close so he could not miss a word. "Listen to me," she said. "A man found me freezing in the dark once and gave me a choice, so now it is yours. You can let go, or you can hold on. Those are the only 2 doors in this room. Choose the second one." His mouth moved, and no sound came out, but his hand turned over under hers and gripped, weak, then less weak, an anchor finding bottom, and he held on. When the doctor finally fought his way in from the storm before dawn, he examined the pressure binding, the elevation, the blankets, the steady if battered pulse, and looked at the exhausted woman propped on a crutch beside the sofa. Whoever did this held his life in their 2 hands, the doctor said. Cora looked down at her hands, one of them still faintly scarred from a hot tray, and said nothing at all. The doctor had done what he could, and gone while the road still allowed it, leaving instructions, medicine, and a warning that the second night would be the one that decided things, and the second night kept its appointment. By dusk, the fever had climbed into Grayson like something moving into an empty house. He burned under the blankets in the study, muttering fragments of harbor names and older names she did not know, and Cora kept her station beside the sofa with cool cloths and the doctor's instructions memorized, changing the compress on his forehead, measuring the medicine by candle-steady hands, listening to the blizzard outside grow a deeper voice. Mrs. Pell and the day staff had been sent home to their families ahead of the storm's second wave, on Cora's own insistence, and Sawyer was still somewhere out in the White City hunting a name, which meant the tall stone house held exactly 2 people, one of them on fire from the inside, and one of them holding the hose. Past midnight, the storm found the power lines. There was no drama to it, just a soft click somewhere in the walls. And the lamps died, and the low hum a house makes without anyone noticing fell silent. And the dark that came in was total, the kind of dark that has texture. Cora sat very still and listened to the radiators begin their long, slow surrender, ticking as they cooled, and she understood the arithmetic immediately, because she had spent a winter learning this house the way you learn a body. Stone walls, high ceilings, a man soaked in fever sweat who could not afford to be cold, and a temperature outside that had teeth. The house had a backup generator. She knew that from her ledger of the place, a serious machine in the basement meant to catch the house when the grid dropped it, and it was not catching. She waited for the cough and rumble of it, and heard only wind, which meant the transfer switch had failed, and the machine was sitting down there in the dark, waiting for a human hand to wake it, and the only human hands available were hers. She lit the storm lantern from the pantry, tucked a wool blanket around Grayson's shoulders, put her lips close to his burning ear, and told him she would be right back, and went to the basement door. The stairs went down steep and narrow into blackness, built in a century that had never imagined a woman with a steel brace descending them alone by lantern light. She went down the way she had learned to go down everything. Lead with the strong leg, trust the crutch, never hurry, and she was 4 steps from the bottom when the crutch tip found a patch of concrete gone slick with condensation and shot sideways. She fell hard onto the stairs, took the edge of a step in the ribs, and slid the rest of the way to the floor in a tangle of lantern light and pain. The lantern survived. She lay there one moment doing inventory, then hauled herself up on the rail and limped on into the dark, past shelves and pipes, following the drawings in her memory to the far corner where the generator crouched, and she found the transfer panel, found the manual lever, and threw her weight on it, and the machine coughed, considered, and began to hum, and somewhere far above her a light she had left switched on came faintly alive at the top of the stairs. The warmth of that small glow lasted exactly as long as it took her to start back up. On the 6th step, her bad leg buckled mid-stride, and this time, the sound that came out of the dark was not her body hitting stone, but something worse, a dry metallic crack from the brace itself, and when she groped down she felt it. The rusted joint at the knee had sheared through, years of corrosion finally presenting its bill on the worst night it could have chosen, and the steel that had held her upright since the hospital now hung loose against her calf like a broken promise. She could not stand. She tried, and the leg folded, and the stairs were long and dark above her, and somewhere at the top of them, a man with a fever was lying in a room, slowly filling with heat that he needed her to guard, so she did not stand. She climbed, elbow and forearm, one knee, the crutch dragged along by 2 fingers, step over step. The lantern hooked in the crook of her arm, throwing huge, slow shadows up the stairwell, and she talked herself upward the whole way in a fierce whisper, the way she had talked him back from the cold, dark water. One more. Choose the second door. One more. She came over the top of the stairs on her elbows, into a hallway washed with restored golden light, and the far-off rumble of the furnace relearning its job, and she dragged herself down the corridor to the study, and pulled herself up against the sofa, and sat on the floor beside him, with her ruined leg out straight, and the broken brace hanging open, and her whole body shaking. His chest rose and fell under the blankets, deep and even. Warmer now, easier now. Cora laid her scraped palm flat over his heart, and felt it keep its steady, stubborn time, and she rested her forehead against the sofa's edge in the golden light. I held it, she whispered to the sleeping house. I held it. On the 3rd morning the fever broke like weather. Grayson surfaced slowly out of a long red dark, and the first thing his mind registered was the quality of the silence, which was the ordinary working silence of his own house, and not the roaring kind he had been swimming through. And the second thing was sunlight, thin winter sunlight lying across the study floor in clean stripes, which meant the storm was over and the world had resumed. He took stock of himself the way he took stock of everything, without moving, eyes half open. The binding around his ribs was firm and expertly layered, tension even all the way around, the work of hands that had done it many times before. Blankets in strata, his boots off, his feet elevated on cushions someone had arranged with a nurse's geometry. On the table, medicine bottles in a disciplined row beside a basin and folded cloths, and then his gaze traveled the room and stopped, and everything in him went quiet in a different way. Propped in the corner by the door stood a steel leg brace, and it was broken, the knee joint sheared clean through, rust blooming at the fracture like something that had been waiting years for permission, and beside it leaned the familiar crutch, and in the armchair beside the sofa, folded awkwardly into a position no one would choose on purpose, Cora was asleep. She slept sitting up, her right leg stretched out stiff and unsupported, and even in sleep her body had not fully let go, one hand still resting on the edge of the sofa near his shoulder as if holding a post she had not been relieved from. Both her elbows wore raw scrapes. There was a fading bruise along one forearm. Her palms, curled open in her lap, were marked like the hands of someone who had climbed something. Grayson lay still for a long time and read the whole night off her body, the way she had learned to read his shoulders, the dead lamps, the cold coming up through the stone, the basement, the stairs, the broken steel, and the climb back, and by the time she stirred and opened her eyes, he had been watching her for many minutes with an expression no one in that city would have recognized. She came awake the way staff come awake, instantly accounted for, checking him first. Their eyes met. "You held my life," he said. His voice was rough gravel from the fever, but the words were level, plain, unornamented, a receipt being read aloud. Cora shifted upright in the chair, wincing, and met the receipt with one of her own. "You picked me up at a bus station," she said. "We're even." Something crossed his face that on any other man she would have called the beginning of a smile, and he let the silence stand for the length of one slow breath, and then he gave the word back to her the way men in his world sealed things heavier than contracts. "Even," he said. And in the thin gold light of that winter morning, something between them quietly changed its name, because a debt has a lender and a borrower, but even is a word between equals. She would not let him talk business until he had eaten, and he discovered he did not mind being outranked in his own study, and it was near noon, with soup finished and the color climbing back into his face, when the front door sounded and Sawyer came in still wearing 3 days of road. He looked at Grayson upright and breathing, glanced once at the broken brace in the corner, and once at Cora's scraped elbows, and filed both without comment. And then he crossed to the desk, took a single folded page from inside his coat, and laid it down. "Found where the money came from," Sawyer said. "The men that night were rented, paid clean, paid well. But the money did not come up from the docks. It came down from the lake shore, from the tall houses." Grayson unfolded the page, and Cora, watching from the armchair, saw a thing she had never seen in all her winter of studying him. His face changed. Not much, an inch of weather, but on that face an inch was a hurricane, and he folded the page again very slowly and looked out the window at the frozen lake for a long, long moment and said nothing at all. Recovery made Grayson restless in a way Cora had learned to work around, and for a week he haunted his own house like a large impatient ghost, forbidden the docks by the doctor, forbidden stairs at speed by Mrs. Pell, and reduced to signing papers and glaring at the frozen lake. So when he appeared in the kitchen doorway one gray afternoon and said, without preface, "Come with me," she assumed there was a household matter somewhere that needed her eyes. He led her up the main staircase, slowly, one hand pressed lightly to his bound ribs, and then down the second-floor hallway, past the linen closets, all the way to the end, and Cora's steps slowed on their own when she understood where they were going, because at the end of that hallway there was only one door, and it was the door nobody cleaned and nobody opened. The door Mrs. Pell had mentioned once, in the voice people reserve for graves. Grayson took a small brass key from his pocket, a key worn bright with handling, though the door it fed was never seen open, and unlocked it, and stood aside. The room was cold and perfectly kept. That was the first thing that struck her, that a room sealed away from the whole life of the house should be immaculate. No dust, no dimness, the work of one person's private hands over many years. Winter light fell through gauze curtains onto a small, quiet universe. A reading chair with a folded green blanket, a shelf of paperback novels, spines cracked with love, a vanity with a hairbrush and a dish of pins laid out as if their owner had just stepped away, and photographs, everywhere photographs. And from every one of them, the same young woman looked out, dark-haired, bright-eyed, caught in a dozen kinds of laughter, on a pier, in a graduation gown, in a garden with her head thrown back, a woman built entirely out of light. On the vanity sat an open jewelry box, holding a thin gold chain, and a ring too small for any hand in that house, and beside it, resting on white tissue in a box lid, a pair of very small shoes, soft white baby shoes with pearl buttons, still carrying somehow the clean, sweet smell of the shop they had come from, never worn but plainly held, often held, the tissue around them creased soft, with years of careful opening and closing. Her name was Meredith, Grayson said. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, and his voice was not the level instrument Cora knew. It was quieter and older. "My sister, Poppy's mother." Cora stood very still among the photographs and let him find his way, and he found it slowly, in short sentences with long silences between them. The way a man walks on ice he does not trust. Meredith had been the one bright thing, he said, the one clean thing he had built his whole ugly kingdom around protecting, and she had been walking home on an ordinary evening when a car came out of the dark too fast, driven by a man with an old name and a young lawyer, and it did not stop. It did not even slow down. And then the machinery Cora knew so well from the inside had started turning. The calls, the settlements, the witnesses who remembered less each week, the file that grew thinner instead of thicker, and by spring the man with the old name was sailing in another state, and the case was a drawer nobody opened. And Grayson had learned in the worst classroom there is that money does not just buy things, it erases them. Poppy had been a baby. Great Aunt June had gathered her up and taken her out to the green, ordinary suburbs and raised her in sunlight. And Grayson had paid for every fence and every school and every duck on that pond, and had kept himself and everything his name meant. At a distance of 1 careful hour's drive, Cora's eyes went back to the small white shoes, and her chest ached, and she understood she still had not been told why she was in this room. Grayson turned from the window and looked at her, and what was in his face made her hold the crutch a little tighter. "That night at the bus station," he said, "you asked me once why I stopped for a stranger, and I let you believe it was principle. It was not principle." He drew a breath. "They found Meredith in the snow," he said. "On her side, in the dark, at the edge of a road, left there like something that had no name. And 5 winters later I am riding home past a dead bus depot, and my headlights cross a woman lying in the snow, on her side, in the dark, left like something that had no name, and my driver has his instructions. We do not stop. We never stop. And I heard my own voice telling him to stop before I knew I had spoken." He looked down at his open hands. "I did not save you out of kindness," he said. "I stopped because I could not save her. You were the stranger my sister never got." The room was very quiet. The winter light lay across the photographs of the laughing woman, and Cora crossed the small distance between them, and for the first time since the night they met, she was the one who reached out and laid her scarred hand over his. Since the night of the basement stairs, Cora had been making do. The broken brace could not be worn, so she had rebuilt her days around its absence. Shorter routes, more rest, the crutch bearing double duty, and she had told no one it mattered, because complaining had never once in her life changed the weight of anything. What she did not know was that the matter had been taken up at the highest level of the house. It began quietly, the way everything he did began. One morning, a stranger arrived in a wool coat, carrying 2 aluminum cases. A trim, silver-haired man who was introduced only as a specialist from out east, and Cora assumed he was there for Grayson's ribs until the specialist set his cases down in the study, looked at her, and asked if she would be comfortable removing her shoe. She looked at Grayson. Grayson looked back with the bland, immovable patience of a man who had already arranged the outcome and was merely waiting for the present to catch up. The specialist, it turned out, had spent 30 years building supports for ruined knees and spines, for athletes and soldiers, and one retired ballerina he mentioned twice with great tenderness, and he had been brought across half the country in winter because the man of this house had telephoned him personally and declined to discuss schedules. What followed was not an examination so much as a survey. The specialist measured her leg the way mapmakers measure a coastline, every angle, every circumference, murmuring numbers to his assistant pen, and the strangest part of the hour was Grayson, who did not leave, who instead picked up the broken steel brace from the corner where it still stood, turned it over in his hands, and began asking questions Cora would never have thought to ask. Where the old joint had carried its load, why the hinge sat where it sat, what the rust had cost in weight, and what the weight had cost in motion. And at one point, the most feared man in the city knelt on his own study carpet, holding a measuring tape against the sheared knee joint, with his sleeves rolled, comparing its height against the specialist's numbers, arguing quietly about pivot points. And the specialist argued back, delighted. And Cora sat with her leg extended between them, feeling like a bridge being surveyed by 2 engineers who intended it to stand for a century. Then the specialist packed his cases and vanished east, and nothing more was said, and January burned down into February. The parcel arrived on an afternoon of hard blue sky. Grayson brought it to the study himself, set it on the desk, and told her to open it. And inside a fitted case, cradled in gray foam, lay a thing that at first glance she did not recognize as belonging to the same species as the rusted contraption in the corner. It was matte black, carbon fiber woven fine as fabric, molded in one flowing line from thigh cuff to heel plate, and it weighed almost nothing. Her 2 hands kept expecting more of it, and kept being wrong, and the knee joint was a small titanium marvel, placed differently than the old one, placed correctly. The specialist's letter explained, aligned with the true center of her knee, instead of fighting a half-inch beside it, and the whole object had the deep, quiet seriousness of armor, not the apology of a medical device, but the confidence of a shield. She could not speak. Grayson took the brace from the case, and then the man whose glance emptied rooms, whose name was a whisper on 12 miles of waterfront, lowered himself onto one knee on the carpet in front of a housemaid and held out his hand for her ruined leg. Cora's breath went thin. Every instinct from every year of her old life told her to protest, to say she could manage, and something newer and wiser told her that this moment did not belong only to her. So she extended the withered leg, and he unbuckled the old broken steel for the last time, worked the cracked leather straps loose with careful, unhurried fingers, and set the whole rusted history of it aside on the floor. And then, before fitting the new brace, he paused, and he looked at her bare, atrophied calf, the thin, twisted shape she had spent her whole life hiding under hems and behind doors, and there was nothing in his gray eyes that she needed to flinch from. No wince, no charity. He studied it the way an engineer studies a load-bearing span he has been asked to reinforce, with respect for what it had carried and intent for what it would carry, and then he seated the carbon shell around it, threaded the straps, adjusted the tension at calf and thigh with 2 small precise pulls, and closed the titanium joint with a click that sounded like a promise being kept. "Stand," he said. She stood. The brace took her weight and gave nothing back. No grind, no drag, no cold bite of rusted steel, only a firm, silent partnership all the way down her right side. And she took one step, and the step did not lurch. And she took another, crossing the study in the long yellow light with her shoulders nearly level for the first time since the rain and the headlights. And at the window she stopped and pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and cried. It came without warning, and she let it, silent and shaking, 27 years of it. And it was the first time in the whole of her life that she had wept for something other than pain. Behind her, Grayson stood watching and said nothing, and the old broken brace lay on the carpet like a shedskin. The visitor came on a day when the house was thin. Grayson had gone to the harbor for the first time since his recovery, Sawyer at his shoulder, and most of the staff were at the far wing taking inventory. So it was Cora who heard the bell, and Cora who opened the tall front door onto a man she had never seen before. Silver cufflinks, a cashmere overcoat the color of ash, and a smile that arrived a half-second before it was needed. He asked for Miss Whitfield, and when she said that was her name, the smile deepened as though she had passed a small test. And he said he represented certain long-standing interests, a family of some history, and that his business was with her alone, and would take only minutes, and was very much to her advantage. Some instinct told her to close the door. A stronger one, the one she had been feeding all winter, told her to hear what the world thought it could buy. She showed him to the small receiving room off the hall, and did not offer coffee. The lawyer, and he was a lawyer, it came off him like cologne, laid his slim leather case flat on the table, unclipped it, and produced 2 objects with the ceremony of a man dealing cards he already knew. The first was a document, perhaps a dozen pages, bound at the corner, dense with the kind of language built to exhaust readers into agreement. The second was a check. He slid the check across the table first, face up, unhurried, and Cora looked down and read it without touching it. And the amount printed there in crisp bank lettering was $2 million, and the check was so new its edges had never been folded, and the name of the account holder at the top, engraved in confident type, was a name she knew better than her own reflection: Ashworth. For a moment the room tilted. The lawyer was talking, his voice smooth as poured cream, phrases sliding past about the regrettable incident of last winter, about how memory, especially memory formed in trauma and darkness and rain, was a famously unreliable instrument, about how the enclosed agreement simply confirmed what medicine already knew, that she recalled nothing of the vehicle, nothing of the driver, nothing of the night at all, and how in recognition of her difficulties a certain family was prepared to be generous, quite absurdly generous, in exchange for that single signature. And Cora heard perhaps 1 word in 3, because her mind was moving down a staircase of its own, step by cold step. Nobody had ever told her who had been driving that car. The police file was a drawer of air. The settlement had been signed over her sleeping body, and in all her wondering she had imagined a stranger, some anonymous rich man from anywhere in the city. But strangers do not send lawyers with $2 million to buy a housemaid's silence. Strangers have nothing to fear from what she might remember. Only one kind of person needed her memory dead and buried, the kind who could not survive her remembering. And the check on the table wore the Ashworth name like a confession, and behind her eyes the last piece slid home with a sound like a lock closing. The service road where she was struck ran along the back of the Ashworth grounds, and the car had come from the direction of the house, out of the gates she polished, out of the garage whose floor she had swept 100 times. And upstairs in that house lived a son who drove too fast and laughed too easily and was, the newspapers said lately, preparing a run for city council. Preston. The lawyer had reached the end of his stream and was holding out a heavy black pen. She looked at it and did not move, and something in her stillness made his manner shift, the cream cooling, and he leaned back and regarded her with the first honest expression of the visit, a kind of bored distaste, and said that he had been instructed to add a personal message should she hesitate. The young gentleman of the family had told him, and here the lawyer's voice took on the borrowed drawl of a man quoting his, "Better, people like her ought to know their price, and be grateful anyone had bothered to set one." The words went through the room like cold air. Cora rose, steady on the black carbon brace, walked to the receiving room door, and opened it. The lawyer studied her a moment longer, then gathered the unsigned agreement, squared its edges, and slid it back into the case along with the unfolded check, unhurried, letting her see how little the refusal weighed. From the doorway he told her that offers of this kind had a lifespan, and that memory, once it became inconvenient, had a way of becoming dangerous. And then he crossed the snowy court to a dark sedan and was gone through the iron gates. Cora stood alone in the hall, one hand braced against the cold stone wall, her heart going like a hammer in a locked room, and the house around her was silent, and the two people she trusted in this world were miles away at the harbor, and she had just looked into the face of the thing that had erased her, and it had a name she had been dusting for 8 years. He knew before he reached the door of his own house. Cora would understand that later, that a man like Grayson did not learn things in the order other people learned them. The gate cameras had already told Sawyer, and Sawyer's face had already told Grayson, and so when he came into the entrance hall that evening, with the cold still on his coat, he was not the man who had knelt on the study carpet with a measuring tape. He was the other one, the one the waterfront knew, Mrs. Pell took one look and evaporated with the tray she was carrying, and the hall emptied the way water empties from a cracked bowl, and Grayson stood in the middle of the marble, with his gloves still on, and looked at Cora, and his eyes were the flat gray of a lake before the ice takes it. "A lawyer for the Ashworth family sat in my house today," he said. His voice was quiet, which was the worst of it, quiet and even, and stripped of everything the winter had grown between them. "In my house, at my table, alone with a woman who spent 8 years on the Ashworth payroll. In the same week my own people are tracing money that runs down from the lake shore." He took one step closer, and the step was soundless. "So you will forgive the question," he said, "but I find I need to hear the answer from your mouth. Tell me what you are in this house for." The words landed like a hand of cold water, and inside her something cried out to explain, to pour out the whole afternoon, the smile that arrived early, the borrowed drawl, the staircase of understanding she had climbed alone in the silent hall. She said none of it, because a winter of reading this man had taught her one true thing, that words were the currency of the world that had tried to buy her, and he had been cheated in words by professionals, and there was only one language left that he had never once been lied to in. Cora turned without a word and crossed to the hall console, where a slim leather folder had been waiting all afternoon exactly where the visitor had left it in parting, squared to the table's edge like a snake arranged to look like a gift, and she carried it back, and she set it down on the marble table between them, and opened it. The agreement lay on top, a dozen dense pages, and she turned it slowly so that it faced him, so that he could see the signature line at the end of it, and the signature line was empty. Beside it she laid the check, and the check said $2 million, and it said Ashworth, and its edges were crisp and unfolded, never creased, never pocketed, never even touched by her hand except to carry the folder it came in. $2 million, unclaimed, lying face up on cold marble between a housemaid and the most dangerous man in the city. The clock in the hall spent 3 long seconds saying nothing, and Cora watched the suspicion die. It did not fade, it broke, the way ice breaks, all at once and from underneath. And what came up through the cracks in his face was not apology but something older and harder to look at. A bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion of a man who had spent his whole life waiting for every hand near him to turn. And she understood then, in the silence, something no one had ever told her in words. Somewhere far back, before the Empire and the Whispers, someone this man had trusted with his blood had sold him. It was written in how fast the coldness had come, and how completely, the way a scar aches quickest in old weather. 2 people stood in that hall, carrying the same wound in different places. Hers from a family that had thrown her away, his from one that had traded him, each looking at the living proof that the other had chosen not to do it again. Grayson looked at the empty signature line for a long time. Then he pulled off his gloves, finger by finger, folded them once, and set them down on the table beside the unfolded check, which from him was a treaty, a surrender, and an apology all at once. And when he finally spoke, his voice had come home. "They offered you $2 million to forget," he said. Cora lifted her chin. "They could not afford what forgetting costs," she said. And for the first time since the bus station, in the cold marble hall, before the unsigned papers, Grayson smiled. Sawyer closed the circle 2 nights later. He came into the study long after the house had gone dark, laid out 4 photographs on the desk like a hand of cards, and talked longer than Cora had ever heard him talk, which was still not long. The root of the night Grayson was hurt, he said, had existed in exactly 4 heads: his own, the driver's, Grayson's, and one more, because the trip had been arranged around a meeting, and the meeting had been scheduled, papered, and timed by the man who papered everything in that house. Whitmore. For a moment nobody spoke. 12 years, Grayson said at last, and his voice had no anger in it, which frightened Cora more than shouting would have. It had only arithmetic. Sawyer dealt the rest of it out, flat and unhurried. The rented men had been paid through a laundry of small companies, and the small companies washed back, one basin at a time, to a development trust on the lakeshore, and the trust wore many polite names, but ate from one table, the Ashworth table. And there was more. He had pulled the harbor ledgers going back 3 years, the offers Grayson had refused without much thought, the shell buyers sniffing at berth leases, the lobbying for a new Port Authority seat, and seen it whole for the first time. A family of builders sitting on towers of money that needed washing, and the cleanest laundry in the city was cargo, manifests, freight, the Grey Kingdom Grayson had spent 20 years fencing off. They had tried to buy the fence. The fence had said no, so they had tried to bury the fence, and when that failed, they had gone back to their older, quieter war, the one Cora had been carrying in her leg all along. Grayson stood very still at the tall window, and Cora, watching from the armchair with her hands folded tight, saw him arrive at the same cliff she had stood on in the receiving room, and step off it into the cold, clear air of certainty. "The man who bought my ambush," he said slowly, "and the man whose son ran you down in the rain, and the man who paid your stepmother to sign you away in your sleep." He turned from the window. One name. It sat in the room with them then, the whole shape of it, and Cora felt something in her chest she had no word for, terrible and steadying at once, because a scattered enemy is a fog, but a single enemy is a door, and doors can be opened. "What did they give Whitmore?" she asked quietly. Sawyer almost smiled. "Not money," he said. "Whitmore has money. They gave him a chair, board seats, a club membership older than the state, his daughter's name on a hospital wing, the clean rooms, the rooms a dock lawyer never gets into no matter how well he launders his grammar." Grayson closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the arithmetic was finished. The following morning was a Thursday, and on Thursdays the head lawyer came, and he came as he always came. Camel overcoat, calibrated smile, the soft, confident hand reaching for the study door to open it without knocking. And this Thursday, for the first time in 12 years, the door was locked. Whitmore stood in the hallway a moment, thrown by half a beat, and then the door was opened from within by Sawyer, who said nothing at all, and Whitmore stepped into a study, arranged like a sentence already passed. Grayson sat behind the desk. Cora stood by the window, because Grayson had asked her to be there. "You were the collateral," he had said. "You will be the witness." And on the near edge of the desk, squared neatly to the corner the way legal papers are squared, lay a single airline ticket. One way. A city very far south, in a country whose language Whitmore did not speak. Whitmore looked at the ticket, and his face performed its whole repertoire in 5 seconds. Puzzlement, indignation, the opening syllable of an explanation, and then, meeting Grayson's eyes, arriving all at once at the truth, the way a man stepping onto a frozen lake hears the first crack and understands the entire winter in his spine. Grayson did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the man who had sold him and spoke as evenly as a clerk reading hours. 12 years you opened that door without knocking, he said, and I let you, because I believed a man could be bought only once, and I had already bought you. My mistake, and I have paid for it." He touched 2 fingers briefly against his ribs, in full. He nodded at the ticket. "That leaves once," he said. "You have until the sun goes down to be gone from this city, and you will want to hurry, because everything you traded me for, the chairs, the clubs, the wing with your daughter's name on it, is built on the family whose books I am about to open, and when they burn, the men who sat in their light burn with them." Whitmore's hand shook as he picked up the ticket. He looked once at Cora by the window, the housemaid he had walked past for a winter without seeing, standing straight on her black brace in the morning light, and whatever he saw in her face made him look away first, and then he was gone, and the study door stood open behind him, and no one ever again entered it unannounced. The parcel came with the ordinary mail on a gray Tuesday, a brown paper package the size of a bread loaf, postmarked from a suburb she had never visited, and Cora nearly set it aside with the household deliveries until she saw the handwriting on the label. She stood in the kitchen holding it for a full minute before she could make her hands move. She knew that handwriting. She had helped teach it, cramped, leaning left, the letter T crossed low. The hand of a boy she had walked to school through 2 winters of her own childhood, a boy who had grown up sharing a roof with her and calling her name down hallways, and who had stood at a frozen bus station with her wallet in his pocket and told her it was for safekeeping. Randy. There was no note inside. She looked twice, 3 times, lifting the packing paper, checking the seams of the box, and there was nothing. No letter, no apology, no explanation, as if the sender had started 100 versions of one and drowned every single one of them, and in the end had simply mailed the things themselves and let them do the talking. On top, wrapped in a grocery bag, lay a folder of papers. She read them standing up, and by the second page she had to sit down. The first document was a photocopy of a power of attorney bearing her own signature, except that it was not her signature. It was close, practiced, a forgery built by someone who had studied her hand across years of birthday cards and grocery lists, and it was dated to a week when Cora Whitfield had been lying in a hospital bed unable to hold a spoon. The second was worse. Bank records, statements in Darlene's name, and there among the tidy columns a single deposit that dwarfed every number around it, wired in 2 days before the settlement was signed, and the paying account traced back not to any insurance company but to a private family trust. And the name on the trust was Lionel Ashworth. Her stepmother had not merely taken the settlement money, she had been paid, separately and in advance, by the father of the man who did it, paid to sign, paid to silence, paid to make the whole matter of Cora disappear while Cora slept. The kitchen was very quiet. Cora set the papers down with strange gentleness, the way you set down something that has just finished exploding, and only then did she see what lay beneath them at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a soft dish towel she recognized before she touched it. Her breath stopped. It was a notebook, thick, water-stained at one corner, its cardboard cover gone velvety with age and handling, held shut by a rubber band that crumbled the moment she moved it, and on the front, in faded blue ink, in a rounder and warmer hand than Randy's, was written one word, recipes, and below it a name, and the name was her mother's. Her mother had died when Cora was 7 years old, and in the scattering afterward, the moves, the remarriage, the shrinking rooms, this notebook had vanished, and Darlene had told her plainly that it was gone, thrown out with the rubbish of the old apartment, and Cora had mourned it for 20 years the way you mourn a second, smaller funeral. It had never been thrown out. Someone had kept it hidden all this time, and someone else, a boy with cramped left-leaning handwriting, had known where, and had taken it, and had mailed it to a sister he could not face. Cora opened the cover with 2 fingers, and there was her mother's writing. Pale blue and slanting sunward, Sunday bread, winter soup, the pie for when somebody is sad, and rising up off the old paper, impossible and undeniable, came the smell, flour and cinnamon, and something underneath that was nothing but time, and one particular kitchen in one vanished apartment, and Cora Whitfield pressed the notebook to her chest with both arms, and bent over it, and in the great stone house of the most feared man in the city, the housemaid sat at the kitchen table and wept for her mother, 20 years late, and right on time, while outside the window the snow began, very quietly, to melt. The Ashworths did not wait to be accused. Within a week of Cora's first quiet visit to the county prosecutor's office, where she had handed over copies of everything in the file and watched a career attorney's eyebrows climb 1 page at a time, the pushback began, and it began the way old money always begins, politely, invisibly, at the edges. The retired garage hand from the Ashworth estate, a stooped and decent man who had told the prosecutor's investigator that yes, he remembered a repair that winter, remembered being told to keep it off the books, telephoned suddenly to say his memory was not what it had been, that he was an old man who confused his years, and that his son had just been blessed with a paid apprenticeship downstate, and he would not be giving any statement after all. The same week, a newspaper that lived on Ashworth advertising ran a soft-lit profile of Preston, candidate, philanthropist, friend of the working family, and buried in the 9th paragraph, unnamed but unmistakable, a warning shot. Sources close to the family described a troubling attempt at extortion by a former domestic employee with a grievance, and, the source added sadly, a documented head injury. Cora read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and the old shame tried to rise in her. The reflex of a woman trained her whole life to shrink from the word trouble, and she looked at it, and set it down, and did not shrink. They were spending money to make her small, and you do not spend money on something that is small. It was on the drive home from her second meeting at the prosecutor's office that they stopped spending money and started spending fear. Sleet had come in off the lake at dusk, the roads greased with it, and Cora rode in the back of one of the house cars with Denner, the young driver, taking the shore road because the highway was jammed, a route of long curves between the water and the bluffs with guardrail on one side and rock on the other. The two pickups came out of a service lane behind them with their lights off. She noticed them first as a wrongness in the mirror glow, two dark shapes closing much too fast for the weather. And then Denner's eyes flicked up, and his hands changed on the wheel, and he said, quietly, "Hold on to something, ma'am," and the night bent sideways. The first truck came up on their flank at the entry to the long north curve, and swung in, not touching, hurting, forcing Denner to choose between the rail and the brakes, and Denner chose neither. He dropped a gear and shot the gap before it closed, and the tires shrieked against the wet asphalt like a living thing, and the guardrail posts flicked past Cora's window in a gray blur, one arm's length away with the black water yawning beyond. The second truck was waiting for the move, and slotted in ahead of them, brake lights flaring, trying to stack them up for its partner, and for 3 long curves the world became geometry at speed, the truck scissoring, Denner reading them, fainting wide, cutting under, the engine howling, sleet hammering the glass. Cora braced across the back seat with the carbon brace jammed against the door and her heart slamming and her mind, in the strange cold way of moments like this, absurdly clear, and in that clarity, as the lead truck swerved close enough to fill her window, she saw it, lit for half a second by their own headlights, small and oval and white against the tailgate's dark paint, a campaign sticker, navy lettering, Preston Ashworth for city council, and the sight of it went into her like a splinter of ice. They had not even bothered to peel it off. That was how little they feared being named. Then the night changed sides. Light flooded the road behind them, 2 sets of high beams coming up out of the sleet at terrible speed, and the truck saw them in the same instant Cora did, and broke off like startled birds, one surging straight ahead and gone, the other diving down a gravel cut toward the old quarry road, and the 2 dark sedans that had been shadowing Cora's car at a distance all evening, on standing orders she had never been told about, swept past in pursuit of the second truck without so much as slowing, and a voice came calm and flat over the radio in Denner's dash, telling him the road ahead was clear. Bring her home. The iron gates had never looked like anything but iron to her before. That night they looked like arms. Grayson was down the front steps before the car had fully stopped, coatless in the sleet, and he opened her door himself, and whatever he saw in her face made his own go very still, and he reached in, and she took his hand, and came out of the car upright, shaking, soaked in adrenaline, alive, and she stood there in the freezing rain gripping his hand with both of hers, and before he could speak, before Sawyer could report, before the great doors could close around her, Cora Whitfield lifted her chin and said the first thing that came, and it came out almost laughing, fierce and bright and unafraid. "They're scared," she said. "Grayson, they're scared of me." The house pretended to sleep that night, and did not. Cora lay in her small room listening to the building breathe, and sometime deep in the dark she heard what she had been half waiting for. The study door, opened softly, by the one man who never made sound by accident, which meant tonight he did not care. She rose, strapped on the brace in the dark with hands that knew every buckle blind, and went down the corridor toward the line of lamplight under the study door, and she did not knock. because a winter in that house had taught her when knocking was a courtesy and when it was a surrender. Grayson stood at the far wall with his back to her. The oil painting that hung there, a dull harbor scene she had dusted 100 times without wondering about, stood swung open on hidden hinges like a small door, and behind it, recessed into the stone, a steel safe stood open, and Cora had imagined, in an idle moment, that a safe in this house would hold money or ledgers or the deeds to half the waterfront. It held those things. It also held, on a shelf of its own, wrapped in oiled cloth that he had already folded back, a heavy black pistol, and Grayson was standing before it, the way a man stands before an old faith he has not practiced in years, but has never once forgotten. And he was not moving, and on the desk behind him lay a single sheet of paper with 2 addresses written on it in his own hand. She knew whose addresses they were. The whole silent house knew. She stepped inside and closed the door, and at the click of the latch he spoke without turning, and his voice was the flat gray one, the waterfront one. "Go back to bed, Cora." She did not go back to bed. She crossed the carpet and put herself in the space between the desk and the safe, directly in his path, which no one on 12 miles of harbor would have dared. And she stood there on the black carbon brace, both feet planted, shoulders level, steadier on her legs than she had ever been in her life, and she made him look at her. "A bullet is cheaper than a trial," he said, still quiet. "It is faster, it is certain, and it is the only language that family has never found a way to buy. They sent trucks after you on an iced road, and they will send worse, and I have ended problems for less than that, and the city sleeps better for some of it, whatever the city says about me in daylight." His eyes went past her to the open steel. "Tell me why I am still standing here." And Cora, who had been asked once at a frozen bus station whether she planned to die, heard herself answer the man who had asked it, and her voice did not shake. "Because if you cross that room," she said, "they win. Not survive, win. Think, Grayson. They cannot beat the evidence. They cannot beat the law once it wakes up. So there is exactly one door out of this for them, and it is you. It is the monster. They need the whisper to be true. They need Preston to stand at a podium in a black tie at a funeral and be right about you. And every door you and I have pried open this winter slams shut, and I go back to being the maid who got mixed up with the harbor killer. And Meredith stays a closed drawer forever, and the man who left me in the rain gets to be the victim." She took one step closer, close enough to see the fever of the thing moving behind his eyes. "You told me once you do not leave things lying dead at your gate," she said. "Then do not leave yourself there. I did not crawl up those basement stairs to save a man so he could hand that family his own soul with the safety off." What happened then happened in silence, and it was the longest silence of the winter. He looked at her, and past her at the steel, and something in him fought itself all the way down. 20 years of doctrine against one lamplit woman, the oldest reflex he owned against the only person alive who had ever stood in this room and told him no. And Cora watched the war, and did not move an inch of ground. And at last Grayson reached past her, slowly, and she stood aside just enough, and he folded the oiled cloth back over the dark shape, and closed the steel door, and turned the handle, and the sound the lock made, a plain, small mechanical sound, seemed to go through the stone house louder than any noise that room could ever have produced. He stood a moment with his hand flat on the closed safe, breathing like a man surfacing. "Then your way," he said, "needs proof that cannot be bought twice." And there he finally almost smiled, "Because it turns out your way has been sitting in my world all along. A car that needed quiet repairs that winter could not go to a dealership. It went underground. And underground, every garage on my waterfront keeps a private book. Dates, plates, damage, cash, insurance for the day. Somebody powerful pretends not to know them. Sawyer pulled the book this evening. The dates match the rain. The plate matches the Ashworth garage. And with the papers Randy sent, the settlement your stepmother signed is not a wall anymore. It is a confession with her name on it." He looked down at the sheet of 2 addresses, picked it up, and fed it to the fire. Spring was still a rumor on the lake when the last car came through the iron gates uninvited. Cora saw it from the front windows, a low silver machine that cost more than most houses, fishtailing slightly on the wet gravel because its driver had never once been told to slow down, and behind it, a dark escort car that unloaded 2 large men in good suits, and then the driver's door swung up, and Preston Ashworth stepped out into the gray morning wearing sunglasses against no sun at all. He came up the steps like a man arriving at his own property, and Mrs. Pell, at a nod from Cora, led him into the receiving room and left him there without offering to take his coat, which in the grammar of that house was a declaration of war he did not have the vocabulary to read. Cora took her time. She finished her coffee in the kitchen, standing, and looked out at the melting snow for a moment. And then she walked down the hall, with the brace clicking its firm, even rhythm on the marble, and she entered the receiving room and looked for the first time in her life directly into the face of the man who had been driving that car in the rain. He was handsome the way an advertisement is handsome, and he had made himself comfortable, one ankle over one knee in the best chair, and his two men stood against the wall like furniture that could hurt you. And on the table he had already laid out fresh papers and a fresh check. And as she came in, he took a heavy pen from his jacket and tossed it onto the stack, where it landed with a clatter, and he smiled at her with all the warmth of a camera flash. "So you're the project," he said, looking her over. The sunglasses pushed up into his hair now, taking in the plain dress, the gray apron, the black brace below the hem. "My father wanted lawyers and committees for this. I told him no. Some things you handle yourself, like a leak under a sink." He nodded toward the papers. "Same terms, better number, last offer, and between us, sweetheart, I am doing you a kindness. Because what exactly is the plan here? Honestly, look at yourself. You can barely stand up straight, and you want to go to war with my family. People like you do not win wars. People like you mop up after them." And Cora, who had imagined this moment for weeks and wondered what it would do to her heart, discovered with a distant scientific interest that it was doing nothing to her at all, that his voice was just weather, that the man who had haunted her leg for a year was, up close, only a bored boy with his father's checkbook, and the discovery made her calm all the way down to the floor. She did not sit. She stood across the table from him, both feet planted, and let the silence get uncomfortable, and when she moved at last, it was to set down on top of his fresh papers the thing she had carried in under her arm, a plain, thick folder, unlabeled, and she squared it neatly to the table's edge, the way she had been squaring linens her whole working life. Preston glanced at it with amusement. "What is this?" he said. "Your resume." "Open it," she said. He opened it, still smiling. He read the first page, and the smile forgot itself. He turned to the second, and the third, and his ankle came down off his knee, and his feet found the floor. And Cora watched the color leave his face in stages, the way ink leaves paper in strong sun, and when he finally looked back up at her, the boredom was gone. And behind it, small and naked, was the beginning of the thing she had seen on that sleet-blackened road, the thing his family had been spending millions to keep out of their eyes. Fear. "You cannot," he began, and stopped, because his voice had come out wrong. Cora leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, and spoke to him quietly, almost gently, the way you explain something final to a child. "Go home," she said, "and tell your father the message got confused somewhere. The housemaid he paid to have thrown away at a bus station, the one who could barely stand, she died out there in the cold, just like he planned. She is gone. What is standing in front of you now is the witness, and the witness does not sign, and the witness does not sell, and the witness remembers everything." One of the men against the wall shifted his weight, and it was at that exact moment that the room changed pressure, and Cora did not need to turn to know why. Grayson came down the last steps of the staircase and crossed the hall and stopped in the receiving room doorway. And he did not speak, and he did not look at the two men in suits. He looked only at Preston, mildly, patiently, the way deep water looks at a swimmer. And against the wall, the two large men glanced at each other and then, without a word passing anywhere, took one step sideways toward the door, and then another, until they were no longer between anyone and anything. Preston gathered his papers with hands that no longer worked smoothly. He left the check. Perhaps he forgot it. Perhaps some last animal instinct told him it might still buy something. And Cora picked it up from the table, crossed to the fireplace where the morning fire was settling into coals, and held the small, crisp fortune out over the flames, and looked back at him. "This is the second time your family has tried to buy my leg," she said. "I did not sell it when I had nothing." She opened her fingers. The check dropped, caught, curled, the fine engraved lettering swelling and blistering as the ink boiled black. And in 3 breaths, $2 million was a gray ash rising up the flue, gone into the winter sky over the lake. "Get out of this house," Cora said, and Preston Ashworth got out, past the silent man in the doorway, out into the melting morning, and the silver car sprayed gravel all the way to the gates, and it sounded, "Mrs." Pell would say later, drying her hands in the kitchen with enormous satisfaction, exactly like running away. What came after was faster than anyone expected, because the truth, once it finally gets a courtroom, moves like spring water through a broken dam. Cora testified on a bright morning in a plain gray dress, her voice level from the first word to the last, and 3 rows behind her sat a young man with cramped left-leaning handwriting, who had driven through the night to tell the court what he had seen signed at his mother's kitchen table. And by the time the season turned, the campaign posters were coming down all over the city. The family trust was answering federal questions it could not afford, and the name Ashworth, which had opened every door on the lakeshore for 3 generations, had become the kind of name people lowered their voices around for entirely new reasons. Justice did not roar. It simply, finally, arrived, wearing paperwork instead of armor, and it was enough. Darlene came in the last week of the melting snow. Cora saw her from the window first, a small figure at the iron gates in a coat too thin for the weather, and something old twisted in her chest and then, examined honestly, settled. The Ashworth money was gone, clawed back by lawyers and judgments, and the woman who had signed away a sleeping stepdaughter now stood outside the tall gates asking to speak with her, and Cora walked down the long drive alone and unhurried, the brace ticking its steady rhythm on the wet stone, and stood on her side of the bars while Darlene wept and reached through them and spoke of family, of misunderstanding, of hard times and mercy, and of how they could help each other now. Surely, after everything, because blood was blood. Cora listened to the whole of it without interrupting, the way you let rain finish. Then she said the only thing she had crossed the drive to say. "You taught me that people like me should cry quietly," she said. "I did, for 20 years. I am done now. These days I live out loud." And she turned and walked back up the drive with her shoulders level, and did not look behind her. And the gates, which had opened for senators and shipping kings, stayed closed. Spring came all at once that year, the way it does on the lake. And on a green morning in May, a crowd gathered in a converted warehouse on the north edge of the harbor district, where a new sign hung over wide, bright doors, the Meredith Center, a training school for cooks and craftspeople whose bodies the working world had written off, funded quietly and entirely by Callaway Freight. And inside, the first class of 18 students was touring gleaming kitchens, fitted with counters at every height, tools rebalanced for every kind of grip. And at the front of it all, in a plain apron with no crest on it, stood the director, Cora Whitfield, who had insisted the stoves go in before the office furniture. The place smelled of fresh paint and, already, of baking, because Poppy had claimed the demonstration kitchen an hour earlier and was conducting a very serious cookie operation with 3 delighted students, flour rising like weather, her laughter ringing off the high windows and out the open doors into the sunshine, and watching her run her happy circles around the big center island. Cora thought that some inheritances are not money at all. Some are a bright room, and the smell of sugar, and a child who has never once been told to be quiet. She felt him before she saw him. Grayson stood in the wide doorway with the spring light behind him, watching her across the busy room the way he had watched from the kitchen door on a winter morning that felt like another lifetime. And this time he did not stay at the threshold. This time he crossed the room to her through the flower dust and the laughter, and took her hand. And when she rose up to meet him, he kissed her, unhurried, in front of the students and the sunlight, and the whole watching spring. Not a rescue and not a reward, but 2 people who had carried each other up out of the dark arriving, at last, on level ground. Someone asked her once, in those first bright weeks, what the school was really for, and Cora answered without needing to think, because her whole life had been the answer. "We spend so long believing our worth is written on our bodies," she said, "on what is broken or whole, on what others will pay for us. It is not. Your worth is the one thing nobody can price and nobody can take. It is the dignity you refuse to sell. And the day you understand that, you stand taller than anyone in the room, whatever legs you stand on." And that is where we leave Cora and Grayson, in a warm, bright kitchen by the water, proof that the people this world throws away are so often the very ones who end up teaching it what a human being is worth. If Cora's journey touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories still to come, because there is a new one waiting for you every day. And tell us in the comments how this story made you feel. What moment stayed with you? What you would have said to Darlene at that gate? We read every word and we truly want to hear what is in your heart. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. We wish you good health, a peaceful mind, and joy in every single day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.